Be careful with trauma-born empath loners. Only 1% of people survive this. And before you assume that's a dramatic opening designed to pull you in and then underwhelm you, I want you to stay with that number for a second. 1%. Not 1% who survive in the physical sense. Not 1% who make it through some catastrophic event. 1% who actually survive the experience of getting close to a trauma-born empath loner and walking away unchanged, unshaken, and completely intact. Because here's what most people don't understand about this particular kind of person. They are not dangerous in the ways the world typically warns you about. They won't raise their voice. They won't chase you. They won't manipulate you with grand gestures or empty promises. Their danger, if you want to call it that, is something far more quiet, far more precise, and far more permanent than anything loud could ever be. And by the end of this episode, whether you are one of these people or you've ever loved one, you are going to understand exactly why so few people who enter their world ever fully leave it. Let's start with what a trauma-born empath loner actually is, because this is not just someone who's shy or introverted or had a difficult childhood. Every one of those things can be true without producing this specific kind of person. A trauma-born empath loner is someone who came into the world already wired for deep feeling, already capable of sensing emotional undercurrents that most people never notice, and then had that sensitivity shaped, forged, really, by an environment that was unsafe. Maybe it was a home with a narcissistic parent who swung between affection and cruelty without warning. Maybe it was emotional neglect, the particular kind where nobody hit you and nobody screamed at you, but nobody actually saw you either. And you grew up in a house full of people feeling completely invisible. Maybe it was betrayal at the hands of someone who should have been safe. A friend, a teacher, a first love, an early caregiver who took the openness of a sensitive child and used it carelessly. Whatever the specific origin, the result is the same. An extraordinarily perceptive, extraordinarily feeling person who learned at a fundamental level that the world is not safe for someone who feels this much. And so they went inside. Not just emotionally, not just psychologically, but in every practical, observable way. They became loners. Not by preference in the way most people choose alone time, by necessity, by the slow accumulation of evidence that most people, most of the time, cannot be trusted with the depth of what they carry. And here is where it gets complicated, because a trauma-born empath loner is not a recluse in the traditional sense. They are not disconnected from humanity. If anything, they are more connected to it than almost anyone you've ever met. They just experience that connection almost entirely from a distance, like someone watching the world through a window so clean it's almost invisible. They observe everything. They understand motivations that people haven't consciously formed yet. They can sit across from you in a conversation and know, with a quiet certainty that would unnerve you if you saw it, not just what you're saying, but what you're not saying. Not just what you feel, but what you're afraid to feel. And they will say nothing. Because one of the first things a trauma-born empath loner learns is that showing someone exactly how much you see them is, more often than not, the fastest way to make them uncomfortable enough to leave. So they hold it. They carry the full weight of their perception silently, almost indefinitely, and present to the world a version of themselves that is warm enough not to alarm anyone, but closed enough to stay protected. The result is someone who seems calm, contained, maybe even a little distant, and is, underneath all of that, one of the most internally complex human beings you will ever encounter. Now here's the part that explains the 1%. Most people who get close to a trauma-born empath loner don't realize what they've actually gotten close to, not at first. What they see is someone interesting, someone a little mysterious, someone who listens in a way that feels different from how anyone else has ever listened to them. And that listening is the thing, because a trauma-born empath doesn't listen the way most people listen. which is essentially waiting for their turn to speak, while absorbing about 40% of what you're actually saying. A trauma-born empath listens with their whole nervous system. They register not just your words, but the slight hesitation before a sentence, the way your energy changes when a certain topic comes up, the thing you almost said and then swallowed back down. And when they reflect something back to you, when they say something that lands in the exact center of what you've been feeling and never managed to articulate, it doesn't feel like conversation. It feels like finally being known, which, for most people, is the most intoxicating experience available to a human being. Because most people go their entire lives never feeling fully known. And here is this person, quiet, careful, unexpectedly precise, and they see you, really see you. And something inside you that was waiting for that, maybe for years, maybe for decades, opens up in a way it hasn't before. That's the moment the 1% statistic starts making sense. Because once someone has felt that, once they've experienced being truly seen by a trauma-born empath loner, even once, even briefly, something shifts in them that cannot be unshifted. It's not infatuation exactly, though it can look like that from the outside. It's more like a recalibration. Their internal standard for what connection is supposed to feel like has been permanently updated, and almost nothing else is ever going to meet that standard again. They will go back to other relationships, other conversations, other people who are easier and less complicated and far more available. And something will feel slightly off in all of them, slightly thinner, slightly less real, and they won't always be able to name why, but they'll know. Some part of them will always know it's because they once sat across from someone who looked straight through every performance they'd ever built and saw what was actually there, and it felt like relief they didn't know they needed. That is what a trauma-born empath loner does to the people who get close enough. Not intentionally, not as a strategy, just as the natural consequence of being a person who operates at a level of depth that most people have never encountered before. But here's what nobody warns the people getting close about. A trauma-born empath loner is also one of the most difficult people in the world to actually stay close to. Not because they're cold, not because they don't care, but because their history has built a security system around their inner world that is extraordinarily sensitive and extraordinarily thorough. Every inconsistency gets registered. Every moment where your behavior doesn't match your words gets quietly filed. Every time you're performing warmth instead of actually feeling it, they feel the gap, even if they never mention it. They are not keeping score in the way a vindictive person keeps score. It's more passive than that, and more devastating because of it. They're simply updating their assessment of whether you are actually safe, and every small inconsistency moves the needle in the wrong direction. And the particularly painful thing is they will rarely tell you this is happening. A trauma-born empath loner has usually learned that expressing their observations makes people defensive, makes people feel surveilled, makes conversations collapse into justifications and arguments that resolve nothing. So they go quiet. They process it internally. And you, the person on the other side, may not even realize anything shifted until you notice that the quality of their presence has changed in some way you can't quite articulate, like a light that's still on in the room, but at a slightly lower wattage than before. This is why so many people who encounter trauma-born empath loners describe the experience in terms that sound more like weather than relationships. They say things like, "I never knew what I was walking into," or "I could feel when something was off, but I could never figure out what." Or the most common one, "I have never felt more seen by someone and more shut out by them at the same time, sometimes within the same conversation." Because the trauma-born empath loner is doing two completely opposite things simultaneously, pulling you into genuine depth with one hand, while keeping the door to their own depth firmly closed with the other. Not because they want to be cruel, because every single time they've opened that door fully, history has given them a reason to regret it. And the weight of that history doesn't just disappear because you seem different, because you seem safe, because everything in the present tense is telling them they could trust you. The body doesn't care about present tense. The body remembers the last time it trusted this much, and what happened after, and it will not be convinced by logic alone. It needs something far more patient, far more consistent, and far more rare than most people are willing to offer. And what that something is, and why almost nobody manages to provide it, and what happens to the extraordinary few who do, that is exactly where we're going next. What that something is not grand. It's not dramatic. It's not the kind of thing that makes a good story at a dinner party or a compelling text message at midnight. The thing that actually reaches a trauma-born empath loner, the thing that moves the needle in the right direction instead of the wrong one, is almost embarrassingly simple in theory and almost impossibly difficult in practice. It is consistency. Not the consistency of showing up when it's convenient. Not the consistency of being kind when the mood is right and the circumstances are easy. The consistency of being exactly who you said you were on day 1, on day 40, on day 112, when nothing about the situation feels new or exciting anymore, and there's no audience watching, and no particular reason to try, except that you said you would. That specific kind of consistency, quiet, unperformative, long haul, is so rare in most people's experience that the trauma-born empath loner has essentially stopped expecting it. Not bitterly, not cynically, just practically, the way you stop expecting the weather to cooperate for an outdoor event after it's rained on enough of them. It's not pessimism, it's pattern recognition, refined by years of very accurate data collection. And here's what makes this so devastating for the people who do want to get close. They often try to prove their consistency through intensity instead of through time. They show up with grand gestures, with deep conversations that go until 3 in the morning, with declarations of how different they are from everyone else she's known. And the trauma-born empath loner feels all of that, registers all of it, is even moved by some of it. But none of it moves the needle the way a quiet Tuesday does. The way a completely ordinary moment of someone doing exactly what they said they'd do, with no fanfare and no expectation of being noticed for it, does. Because intensity is easy. Intensity is adrenaline and chemistry and the particular electricity of a new connection. Intensity doesn't cost anything except presence in the moment, which most people can manage when the moment is exciting enough. Consistency costs everything else. It costs the long, unglamorous middle of actually knowing someone, of staying when the newness has worn off, of choosing to show up on the days when showing up requires something real from you. And the trauma-born empath loner knows the difference between the two in her nervous system before her mind has finished processing what's happening. She's not testing you intentionally. She's observing you inevitably. And what she's observing, always, is not what you do when you're trying to impress her. It's what you do when you think she's not watching. Now let's talk about what's actually happening inside the trauma-born empath loner during all of this. Because we've spent a lot of time on what they do and how they affect others, and not enough time on what it actually costs them to live this way. Because from the outside, a trauma-born empath loner can look almost enviably self-contained. They don't seem to need much. They seem comfortable in their own company. They seem, in the word people reach for most often, fine. And that fine is one of the most exhausting performances a human being can maintain. Not because it's entirely false. They have genuinely built a rich, textured inner life that does sustain them in ways that most people's external social lives never quite manage to. But because underneath the fine is something that never fully goes away. A longing that they've learned not to articulate, because articulating it has historically led either to disappointment or to being used. A longing not just for connection, because they have access to a kind of internal connection with their own emotional world that most people will never develop. A longing specifically for the kind of connection where they don't have to manage the other person's reaction to who they actually are, where they can put down the careful, calibrated version of themselves they present to the world and just exist fully in the presence of someone who can hold that without flinching and without making it about themselves. That is what they're actually hungry for. And that particular hunger goes unfed for so long in most trauma-born empath loners that some of them genuinely stop believing it's a real option. Not because they've given up on people entirely, because they've become too accurate about people to keep pretending that what most relationships offer even comes close to what they actually need. This is the specific tragedy at the center of a trauma-born empath loner's life, and it doesn't get talked about enough. Their sensitivity, the very thing that makes them capable of the deepest, most transformative connection available between two human beings, is the same thing that makes ordinary connection feel insufficient. They cannot unknow what they know. They cannot unfeel what they feel. They cannot pretend that a surface-level friendship satisfies something that requires depth the way they require it, any more than someone who can hear every frequency of music could genuinely enjoy a song with half the instruments removed and pretend the sound was complete. So they end up in this particular kind of solitude that is not loneliness in the conventional sense, but is its own distinct ache. The ache of being someone whose full self has never had a room large enough to exist in, with another person present for long enough to feel like home. And yet, and this is the part I don't want you to miss, because it's the part that actually matters most. The trauma-born empath loner is not without hope, not even close, because here's what the survival of that 1% actually looks like from the inside. The people who survive getting close to a trauma-born empath loner, who don't walk away changed beyond recognition, who don't spend years afterward measuring every subsequent relationship against the standard she set without meaning to. They are not the ones who tried hardest. They're not the ones who showed up with the most intensity, or the most declarations, or the most elaborate proofs of their worthiness. The ones who survive are the ones who stopped trying to earn her and started simply being real in her presence, who made peace with the fact that she was going to see them fully, accurately, without the flattering edit most relationships allow, and decided that being seen was something they could live with, who didn't need her to be easier, or less complex, or more available on their timeline, who understood, without being told, that the door to her inner world opens from the inside only, and that the only thing that actually influences whether it opens is not pressure, not charm, not persistence, but patience of a quality so genuine it stops feeling like strategy and starts feeling like character. Because that's ultimately what the trauma-born empath loner is waiting to encounter, even if she's stopped consciously waiting. Not the perfect person. Not someone without their own damage or their own complications. Someone whose damage doesn't make them dangerous. Someone who has done enough of their own reckoning that they can sit in the presence of depth without either running from it or trying to consume it. Someone who wants to know her, not possess her. Who is curious about her, not fascinated by her in the way people are fascinated by things they want to collect. Who will still be showing up, quietly and without performance, 6 months from now, and will be doing so because it genuinely makes sense to them, not because they're still trying to crack the code of someone they see as a puzzle to be solved. The trauma-born empath loner is not a puzzle. She is a person who paid a very high price for a very specific kind of depth. And what she is ultimately asking, in the only language her history allows her to ask in, which is the language of observation and time and the slow, quiet accumulation of evidence, is simply this: are you actually here? Not excited to be here, not strategically here. Actually, genuinely, for no performance reason, here. And if the answer to that question is yes, and if that yes holds up not just today, but in the ordinary, unglamorous, unwitnessed days that follow, then something opens in her that has no comparison in any other kind of relationship you will ever experience. Because a trauma-born empath loner who finally, fully trusts someone doesn't just love them. She sees them, all the way down, all the way through, with a clarity and a completeness that most people spend their entire lives hoping someone will offer them and never receive. And if you are one of the 1% who earns that, who stays long enough and stays real enough to receive it, you will understand, without needing it explained, exactly why nobody who has ever experienced it has ever quite been the same afterward.